You mentioned earlier interactions you had with Jake Sullivan. Don't tell us what we shouldn't hear, but does the administration consult with you, Professor Mearsheimer?
No, not at all. No administration has ever consulted with me because I'm much too much of a contrarian. If you don't,
Why we love you.
no, if you don't conform to what is the conventional wisdom inside the foreign policy establishment in the United States, people don't want to talk to you. In fact,
I would think that they would want you to challenge their thinking, even if it's at a round table with a light lunch or with a cup of coffee. But they don't want that.
I agree 100%. I would just point out to you that I opposed the Iraq War along with a number of my friends in 2003. And I believe we're very smart. We know a lot about war. And I believe we had good arguments. The administration, it was the Bush administration then, had absolutely no interest in hearing what we had to say. And my rhetoric about that situation is exactly the rhetoric that you were just putting forward. You would think these people would want to hear what their critics have to say so that they can either knock their critics down or make an adjustment in their policy to accommodate some good points that the critics made. But that's not the way things work in the United States anymore. You're either on board or you're not.
The United States of America. Now I'm going to go into an area of your fellow West Pointer and a person whose work I admire almost as much as I admire yours, Andrew Bacevich, Professor Bacevich. The United States of America leads an international order destined, well, in the U.S. view, to enhance U.S. empire, but destined to collapse. Why is that Western order, led by the United States of America, not hesitating to use violence, either by others or by us, destined to collapse?
Well, it's destined to collapse for two reasons, in my opinion. One is with the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power. We've moved from a unipolar world where we dominated the planet to a multipolar world where we can no longer dominate because we have two other great powers to deal with. The second reason is we behave in such a ham-fisted way that we alienate countries all over the world. And if you're going to have a rules-based order and you expect other countries to obey these rules, which you have largely written, then you have to obey them as well. And you have to operate in ways that are somewhat accommodating to other countries in the world. But our basic policy dictum is it's my way or the highway. So when you combine that, again, with the shift in the global distribution of power, the liberal international order that we constructed during the unipolar moment is kaput.
My way or the highway, and it doesn't matter which party is in the White House or which party controls Congress. The impulse for empire seems to be the same from post-World War II up to the present moment.
Yeah, I refer to the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. I agree with you.
I refer to them as the war party. I sometimes add other words in there: warfare, welfare, national security, deep state, whatever you want to call it. That's them.
I've taken to saying, Andrew, that I think the United States is addicted to war. It's
yes,
quite remarkable the extent to which we're willing to go out and fight wars. And anybody who protests against that policy is persona non grata.
And of course, the last declared war was World War II. Since then, all these wars, all this military activity, at the impulse of the executive, Congress either funding it or looking the other way. I remember when Barack Obama bombed Libya, was asked, why didn't you make a war powers resolution information to the Congress? Well, I didn't use the military. Who the hell did you use? I used the CIA. He didn't say CIA. He said I used other assets that were not military. So there's so much at the president's fingertips that allow the president to avoid the strictures of the Constitution And Congress, as I said, often looks the other way. I mean, the last time Congress tried to stop a president, I think, was probably Richard Nixon when he bombed Cambodia, and the War Powers Resolution didn't stop him at all.
Yeah, I think it was in the Gerald Ford years. It was when Vietnam was going down the tubes. South Vietnam was going down the tubes in the spring of 1975. Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford wanted to use military force to intervene, as we had intervened with air power in May of 1972. But Congress laid down the law and said, absolutely not. And we stood aside while South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam. I sometimes joke that if we hadn't had that congressional legislation, we'd still be fighting in Vietnam today.
Wow. Wow. Bringing you back to Ukraine, Professor Mearsheimer, do the globalists, does the State Department, does the Defense Department, do their colleagues in Western Europe at least have a theory as to how Ukraine can prevail? I don't mean a theory from February of 22, but a theory now, after all the horrible things that have happened to Ukraine. If Tony Blinken were here and we weren't taping this and he were being candid, what would he say?
They have no strategy. And the simple reason is there is no strategy. I mean, I can't think of one. I'm sure you can't think of one. And you and I are both clever guys who are very well educated and good at making clever arguments. And if we can't come up with a clever strategy that stands some reasonable chance of pulling our chestnuts out of the fire, you can rest assured that the likes of Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden are not going to find that magic formula. It just doesn't exist.
Right. How do you see?
We're screwed.
How do you see this ending, Professor Mearsheimer?
Well, my view is, if you look at the balance of forces, the Russians are building up a mighty army. They mobilized 300,000 troops in late September of last year. That's 2022. And they have at least 400,000 people who will have enlisted over the course of this year, 2023. So that's adding 700,000 troops to the number that existed when the war began. And some people argue that there's secret mobilizations taking place on the Russian side as well. But they're going to have a huge army. They have almost total control of the skies. They have a huge advantage in weaponry. And the Ukrainians have been chewed up badly. So I think what will happen is the Russians will conquer more territory. But I do not think they will go into Western Ukraine. And the main reason is that Western Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate the Russians. And they would be occupying territory that would lead to no end of trouble. As I like to say, it would be like swallowing a porcupine. So my guess is that they'll take 4 more oblasts. They'll end up taking close to 50% of Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia. And then they'll go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine remains a dysfunctional rump state, which is effectively what it is now. So I like to say that the Russians will win, or are likely to win, an ugly victory.
I've argued that the globalists, and I've mentioned a number of names, and I've forgotten, but I have to add her. My audience sometimes thinks I'm picking on her, Victoria Nuland, that the globalists want to use Ukraine as a battering ram to drive President Putin from office. So 2 questions for you before we finish, Professor Mearsheimer. Is President Putin more powerful and stable in office now, or was he more powerful and stable in office 2 years ago? And 2, do you fear the introduction of American ground troops?
With regard to the first question, I think when you had that big dust up with Prigozhin involving the Wagner group, that it looked like Putin was not in the best of shape in terms of the stability of the regime. But he's dealt with Prigozhin. Prigozhin's out of the picture, obviously. The Wagner group is off the table. And because Russia is doing very well on the battlefield and the future looks good, I think Putin is in excellent shape. I think he's in as good shape as he was before the war started. I mean, our great hope, especially at the time of the Prigozhin affair, was that Putin would be toppled, some peace-loving doper would come into power and cut a deal with us. That was not a reasonable hope, in my opinion. But regardless, it's no longer possible. Putin is here for the foreseeable future, unless he has a heart attack or something like that. Your other question was what?
Do you fear an expansion of the war involving American ground troops? In other words, another Vietnam, another disaster.
Well, it would be much worse than Vietnam. You want to remember, Vietnam was a war between a great power, the United States, and a minor power, Vietnam. For
Right.
sure, the Chinese and the Russians helped the Vietnamese, but we were not fighting each other on the battlefield. This would be a great power war. I mean, if we get into the actual fighting in Ukraine, it's the United States versus the Russians. And that would be an absolutely horrible situation. I think it's unlikely, in large part because I think the Biden administration, to its credit, understands that that's something we absolutely want to avoid. But the question you have to ask yourself is, if I'm right and the Russians are sort of on the verge of going on a roll and the Ukrainians are really in desperate straits, what are we going to do? Are we going to stand aside? I mean, this is going to be a humiliating defeat for us. It's a humiliating defeat for NATO. The temptation for us to get involved will be great. I've long argued that the two great dangers are, number one, that the Russians are losing, in which case I think it's likely they would use nuclear weapons, or number two, the Ukrainians are losing, suffering a devastating defeat, or in the process of suffering a devastating defeat, and we come in to rescue them.
Oh,
now,
boy.
I don't think that's likely, but you and I know enough about the foolish moves the United States has made, over the past few decades, that you don't want to rule out that possibility. Again, I don't think it's likely, but it is scary. I mean, we're in a very dangerous situation here.
I wish they would listen to you. Professor Mearsheimer, it's been a pleasure. I hope you'll come back again. I can tell from the comments and the number of people watching that your time and your intellect and your sharing your intellect with us are very much appreciated.
Thank you, Andrew, and I'd be happy to come back another time.
Thank you. Thank you again, Professor.